The crisp autumn morning at Buckingham Palace carried an unusual tension that Sergeant David Matthews couldn't quite identify. He had served as a royal protection officer for 8 years, and his instincts had been sharpened by countless hours of training and real-world experience. Something felt different today. Though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was setting off his internal alarms, Matthews stood at his assigned position near the grand entrance, his trained eyes constantly scanning the crowds that had gathered for the Queen's scheduled public appearance. Today marked the annual Commonwealth Day celebration. Thousands of people had lined the streets since dawn, hoping to catch a glimpse of Her Majesty as she made her way to Westminster Abbey for the special service. At 42 years old, Matthews was considered one of the most experienced protection officers in the royal security detail. His military background in the Special Air Service had prepared him for the kind of split-second decision-making that his current role sometimes demanded. He had a wife, Sarah, and 2 young children at home, but when he was on duty, his complete focus belonged to the safety of the royal family. The morning briefing had been routine, covering the usual protocols for public appearances and the standard security measures that would be in place throughout the day. Intelligence reports had shown no specific threats, and the event was classified as having a normal risk level. Yet Matthews found himself more alert than usual, his senses heightened in a way that reminded him of his days in active combat zones. Queen Elizabeth II emerged from the palace at precisely 10:30, as scheduled. At 96 years old, she moved with the careful dignity that had characterized her public appearances for decades. Her pale blue coat and matching hat were perfectly coordinated, and her famous handbag hung from her arm in its customary position. Despite her advanced age, her eyes were still sharp and aware, taking in the cheering crowds with the practiced ease of someone who had been in the public eye for over 7 decades. Matthews positioned himself 6 feet behind and to the left of the Queen as she began her walkabout, greeting selected members of the public who had been screened and positioned along the designated route. The other protection officers took their assigned positions, creating an invisible but impenetrable security perimeter around the monarch. The crowd's enthusiasm was infectious, with people of all ages waving flags and calling out greetings to the Queen. Children held handmade signs. Elderly veterans stood at attention in their old uniforms, and families had traveled from across the country for this opportunity to see their sovereign in person. The atmosphere was festive and celebratory, exactly the kind of positive public engagement that the royal family valued most as they moved along the predetermined route. Matthews noticed a man in his 30s standing near the middle of the crowd barrier. Unlike the other spectators who were focused entirely on the Queen's approach, this individual seemed to be scanning the security arrangements with unusual intensity. His posture was tense, and his hands were buried deep in the pockets of his dark overcoat. Despite the mild weather, Matthews made a mental note of the man's position and appearance while continuing his protective duties. Years of experience had taught him that potential threats often revealed themselves through subtle behavioral cues rather than obvious hostile actions. The man's nervous energy and focused attention on the security detail rather than the Queen herself triggered every instinct Matthews had developed during his years of service. The Queen continued her walkabout, stopping to receive flowers from a group of school children and exchanging brief pleasantries with a World War II veteran who had been waiting since sunrise for this moment. Her interactions were warm and genuine, demonstrating the personal touch that had made her beloved by millions of people throughout the Commonwealth. As they approached the section of the barrier where the suspicious individual was standing, Matthews moved closer to the Queen's position while maintaining the appearance of routine protection duties. His hand moved unconsciously to the radio clipped to his jacket, ready to alert the rest of the security team if the situation required immediate action. The man in the dark overcoat suddenly straightened up as the Queen drew near, his right hand moving inside his jacket in a motion that made Matthew's blood run cold. In that instant, training and instinct merged into a certainty that this was not an innocent gesture by an excited spectator. The movement was too deliberate, too practiced, and too focused on concealment to be anything other than a threat. Matthews' mind raced through the protocols he had memorized and practiced countless times during training exercises. The safety of the Queen was paramount. overriding every other consideration, including his own personal welfare. He had sworn an oath to protect her with his life if necessary, and that moment of absolute commitment was now being tested in real time. The crowd noise seemed to fade into the background as Matthews focused entirely on the potential threat. The man's eyes met his for a split second, and in that brief moment of contact, Matthews saw something that confirmed his worst fears. There was a cold determination in the stranger's gaze, the look of someone who had moved beyond rational thought into the realm of dangerous action. Time seemed to slow down as Matthews calculated distances and angles, assessing his options while the Queen continued her approach toward what he was now certain was mortal danger. The other protection officers had not yet noticed the threat, focused as they were on their own assigned sectors of responsibility. The realization hit him that he might be the only person in position to prevent a catastrophe that would shock not only the nation but the entire world. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he prepared to make a decision that would either save the Queen's life or cost him his own. Everything he had trained for, everything he believed in, and everyone he loved seemed to crystallize into this single point in time, where duty and courage would be tested against the ultimate threat to the person he had sworn to protect. Matthews took a deep breath and prepared to act, knowing that the next few seconds would determine not only the Queen's fate, but the course of his own life and the lives of everyone who mattered to him. The stranger's hand continued its movement inside his jacket, and Matthews could see the outline of something metallic being withdrawn from concealment. Every second stretched like an eternity as the protection officer's training kicked into overdrive, his body already beginning to move before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision to act. The Queen was now less than 10 feet from the potential attacker, still smiling graciously at the crowd and completely unaware of the danger that was unfolding just yards away. Her security detail was functioning normally, with officers scanning their assigned sectors and maintaining the protective formation that had been drilled into them through countless hours of practice and preparation. Matthews broke from his assigned position without waiting for authorization or backup. His movement was swift and decisive, cutting through the carefully maintained security perimeter like a man possessed by singular purpose. The other protection officers noticed his sudden deviation from protocol, but they were still processing what they were seeing when Matthews launched himself toward the threat. The man in the dark overcoat had fully withdrawn what Matthews could now see was a handgun, its barrel gleaming dully in the autumn sunlight. The weapon was already being raised toward the Queen when Matthews reached the barrier that separated the crowd from the royal party. Without hesitation, he vaulted over the metal barricade with an athletic grace that belied his 42 years and the weight of his protective equipment. The crowd around the gunman began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Screams erupted from nearby spectators as they saw the weapon and understood the mortal danger that their beloved monarch was facing. Panic began to spread through the previously jubilant gathering, with people pushing and shoving in their desperation to escape what they now realized was a life-threatening situation. Matthews tackled the gunman with the full force of his body, driving the man backward into the crowd behind him. The impact sent both men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs in desperation, with Matthews fighting to control the weapon while the attacker struggled to complete his deadly mission. The gun discharged once during the struggle, the sharp crack of the gunshot causing additional panic among the fleeing spectators. The bullet went wide, bedding itself harmlessly in a nearby tree, but the sound served as an unmistakable signal to the rest of the security team that a genuine threat was being confronted. Within seconds, additional protection officers were converging on Matthews' position, their own weapons drawn and their training taking over as they moved to neutralize the danger and secure the Queen's safety. Matthews managed to wrench the gun away from his opponent, but not before the attacker landed several desperate blows to his head and torso. Blood streamed down the protection officer's face from a gash above his left eye, but he maintained his grip on both the weapon and the man who had tried to use it against the Queen. His military training served him well in the hand-to-hand combat situation, allowing him to maintain control despite his injuries and the chaotic circumstances surrounding the struggle. Queen Elizabeth II had been immediately surrounded by her remaining protection officers and moved away from the scene of the confrontation, but not before she had seen enough to understand what had just transpired. The elderly monarch's face showed a mixture of shock and concern, as she was quickly escorted toward the safety of her waiting vehicle, her scheduled public appearance now secondary to the paramount need for her personal security. The gunman, later identified as Marcus Thompson, 34-year-old former military serviceman with a history of mental health issues, was quickly subdued by the converging security personnel. His motivations would remain unclear in the immediate aftermath of the attack, though subsequent investigation would reveal a complex mixture of personal grievances and delusional thinking that had led him to target the Queen. Matthews remained conscious throughout the struggle, but the adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to wear off, leaving him aware of the full extent of his injuries. In addition to the head wound, he had sustained damage to his ribs and left shoulder during the fight. Medical personnel were already on scene, having been positioned strategically throughout the area as part of the standard security protocols for royal public appearances. As paramedics worked to stabilize his condition, Matthew's thoughts turned to his family and the implications of his actions. He had acted instinctively to protect the Queen, but he was also acutely aware that he had broken protocol by leaving his assigned position and engaging a threat without proper authorization. The potential consequences for his career and his family's financial security weighed heavily on his mind, even as medical professionals tended to his wounds. The scene around him was one of controlled chaos as police officers worked to secure the area and interview witnesses, while security personnel conducted thorough sweeps to ensure that no additional threats remained. The carefully planned public celebration had been transformed in a matter of seconds into a crime scene that would be investigated and analyzed for months to come. News cameras that had been positioned to capture the Queen's walkabout had instead recorded one of the most dramatic assassination attempts in modern British history. The footage would soon be broadcast around the world, showing Matthew's heroic intervention and the split-second timing that had prevented what could have been an unthinkable tragedy. The Queen, now safely secured in her vehicle, insisted on being informed about Matthew's condition before departing the scene. Her concern for the man who had risked his life to save hers was evident to everyone present, and she made it clear that she wanted to be kept informed of his recovery, and that his actions would not be forgotten or go unward. Dard, semblin hours. Carrying Matthews departed for the hospital, crowds of people who had witnessed his heroic actions began to gather along the route, many of them applauding despite the traumatic nature of what they had just experienced. Word was already spreading through social media and news networks about the royal protection officer, who had quite literally thrown himself between the Queen and a would-be assassin. The immediate crisis was over, but the repercussions of those few seconds of violence and heroism were just beginning to unfold in ways that would surprise everyone involved, including Matthews himself. St. Mary's Hospital in London had never received a patient quite like Sergeant David Matthews. Within an hour of his arrival, the entire facility had been placed under heightened security protocols, while medical staff worked to treat his injuries and law enforcement officials prepared to conduct what would become one of the most important debriefings in recent royal protection history. Matthews lay in the emergency room, his head wound requiring 12 stitches while doctors examined his ribs for potential fractures. The physical pain was manageable, but his mind was racing with concerns about the immediate aftermath of his actions and the long-term implications for his career and family. He had acted on instinct and training, but he was also aware that his decision to break from assigned protocols was to be scrutinized at the highest levels of government and royal administration. Sarah Matthews received the phone call that every protection officer's spouse dreads while she was at work at the local primary school where she taught third grade. The voice on the other end of the line was professional but kind, informing her that her husband had been injured in the line of duty and was being treated at St. Mary's Hospital. The caller could not provide details about the nature of the incident, but assured her that David's injuries were not life-threatening and that transportation would be provided for her immediate travel to London. The journey from their home in Windsor to the hospital seemed endless for Sarah, mind filled with worst-case scenarios and fears about what kind of situation could have led to David being injured during what was supposed to be a routine royal engagement. She had lived with the knowledge that his job carried inherent risks, but the reality of receiving that phone call had shaken her more deeply than she had expected. Meanwhile, at Scotland Yard, a crisis management team was being assembled to handle the investigation and media response to what was already being called the most serious threat to the Queen's life in decades. Detective Inspector Helen Morrison was assigned as lead investigator, her extensive experience with high-profile cases making her the natural choice for such a sensitive matter. The preliminary investigation into Marcus Thompson's background revealed a troubling pattern of recent behavior that should have raised red flags in the security screening process. Thompson had been discharged from the military 2 years earlier following a psychological evaluation that had questioned his fitness for continued service. He had subsequently struggled with employment and had been receiving treatment for depression and anxiety, though he had recently stopped taking his prescribed medication. More concerning was the discovery that Thompson had been researching the Queen's public schedule online for several weeks prior to the attack. His internet search history showed an obsessive interest in royal security arrangements and previous assassination attempts on members of the royal family. The investigation would later reveal that he had attended 3 other royal events in the past month, apparently studying security protocols and looking for vulnerabilities in the protection arrangements. Back at the hospital, Mathus was visited by Commander James Richardson, the head of Royal Protection, who needed to conduct an immediate debriefing. While the events were still fresh in the protection officer's memory, Richardson was a career law enforcement professional who had worked his way up through the ranks of royal security. He understood better than most the split-second decision-making that Matthews had faced. David Richardson began, settling into the chair beside the hospital bed. I need you to walk me through everything that happened from the moment you first noticed Thompson until backup arrived. Don't leave out any details, no matter how minor they might seem. Matthews recounted the events methodically, describing his initial suspicions about Thompson's behavior and the specific actions that had triggered his decision to intervene. Richardson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but primarily focused on understanding the thought process that had led to such a dramatic departure from standard protocols. You broke formation without authorization, Richardson? Observed when Matthews had finished his account. You engaged a threat without backup, and you left the Queen's immediate vicinity unprotected while you did so. Under normal circumstances, those actions would result in immediate suspension and disciplinary proceedings. Matthews nodded, having expected this conversation. I understand, sir. But in that moment, I was certain that if I followed standard protocol and waited for authorization, the Queen would have been shot before backup could respond. The threat was immediate and specific, and I was the only one in position to stop it. Richardson studied the injured officer carefully. Your actions were successful, and there's no question that you saved the Queen's life. But the investigation will need to determine whether your assessment of the threat was accurate and whether the risk you took was justified by the circumstances. The media response to the incident was unlike anything the royal family had experienced. In recent memory, within hours of the attack, news organizations around the world were broadcasting footage of Matthews' heroic intervention, and social media platforms were flooded with messages of support and admiration for the protection officer who had risked everything to save the Queen. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with people from all walks of life praising Matthews' courage and dedication to duty. Petition campaigns began appearing online, calling for him to be honored for his actions rather than punished for breaking protocol. The hashtag #HeroicGuard began trending globally, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of respect and admiration for the Royal Protection Services. However, the internal response within the Royal Protection Organization was more complicated. While everyone acknowledged that Matthews had prevented a potential tragedy, there were serious concerns about the precedent his actions might set for other officers, might interpret his example as permission to break established protocols. Whenever they felt it was justified, Queen Elizabeth II herself requested hourly updates on Matthews' condition and made clear to her private secretary that she wanted to personally thank the man who had saved her life. The Queen's personal physician was consulted about her own condition following the traumatic experience. But the 96-year-old monarch showed remarkable resilience in dealing with what could have been her final public appearance. As the investigation continued and Matthews began his physical recovery, it became increasingly clear that the events of that autumn morning had set in motion a chain of consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate participants. The incident had raised fundamental questions about royal security protocols, the training and authority of protection officers, and the balance between following orders and taking initiative in life-threatening situations. The nation waited anxiously for official word about Matthew's fate, while the protection officer himself struggled with the knowledge that his split-second decision to save the Queen's life had created a situation with implications that none of them could have anticipated. 3 days after the assassination attempt, Matthews was resting in his private hospital room when a commotion in the corridor outside caught his attention. Through his partially open door, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of increased security, activity, and hushed, urgent conversations among hospital staff. His years of protection experience had trained him to recognize these patterns, but he never imagined they might be related to his own situation. Sarah had been maintaining a constant vigil at his bedside, leaving only briefly to call their children and ensure they understood that their father was safe and recovering well. The media attention had been overwhelming, with reporters and photographers gathered outside their family home in the hospital, all seeking additional details about the man being hailed as a national hero. Dr. Patricia Wells, the senior physician overseeing Matthew's care, entered the room with an expression that mixed professional concern with barely contained excitement. "David," she said carefully, "I need you to know that we're going to have some very important visitors this afternoon. I wanted to prepare you and Sarah so that you wouldn't be caught off guard by the additional security measures." Before Matthews could ask for clarification, Commander Richardson appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the extraordinary pressure he had been under since the incident. Behind him stood 2 additional figures that made Matthew's heart skip a beat. The Queen's private secretary and her personal protection officer. "Your Majesty has requested permission to visit you personally," Richardson announced, his formal tone barely concealing his own amazement at this unprecedented development. "She wishes to thank you directly for your actions and to discuss the implications of what occurred." Sarah gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what this meant. In all the years of David's service, they had never imagined that the Queen might visit him personally, let alone under such extraordinary circumstances. The honor was almost incomprehensible, but it also added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. The hospital had been quietly cleared of non-essential personnel, and additional security measures had been implemented throughout the facility. The Queen's visit would be brief and private, but the logistics required to ensure her safety while she visited the man who had saved her life were extraordinary in their scope and complexity. Matthew spent the next several hours in a state of nervous anticipation, reviewing in his mind everything he wanted to say to the monarch whose life he had preserved. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, made more intense by the knowledge that his actions were still under official investigation and his future remained uncertain. Queen Elizabeth II arrived at the hospital precisely on schedule, her movements coordinated with military precision by her security detail. Despite her advanced age and the traumatic experience she had endured just days earlier, she appeared composed and determined as she made her way through the hospital corridors toward Matthew's room. The protection officer struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed as the Queen entered, but she immediately gestured for him to remain comfortable. "Please don't strain yourself, Sergeant Matthews," she said, with the gentle authority that had characterized her interactions with subjects throughout her reign. "You've already done quite enough on my behalf." Sarah stood nervously at the foot of the bed, overwhelmed by the surreal experience of meeting the Queen under such extraordinary circumstances. Her Majesty acknowledged her presence with a warm smile and a few kind words about the sacrifice that military families make when their loved ones serve in dangerous positions. "I wanted to thank you personally for your actions," the Queen continued, addressing Matthews directly. What you did required not only courage, but also the kind of split-second judgment that cannot be taught in any training program. You risked your own life to save mine, and I will never forget that sacrifice." Matthews found his voice despite the emotional intensity of the moment.
"Your Majesty, I was simply doing my duty as I understood it."
"The oath I took when I joined the protection service was to guard your life with my own if necessary. That's exactly what the situation required." The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but duty and courage are not always the same thing. Many people understand their duty, but lack the courage to act when the moment demands it. You demonstrated both, and in doing so, you exemplified the very best traditions of service to the crown." Their conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which the Queen asked detailed questions about Matthew's recovery and his family's well-being. She also inquired about his thoughts on the incident and whether he felt that current security protocols were adequate for dealing with such threats. Her questions revealed a sharp intelligence and genuine concern for the practical implications of what had occurred when the Queen prepared to leave. She made a statement that would change everything for Matthews and his family. "I have spoken with the Prime Minister and with the heads of the security services," she announced formally. "Your actions will be officially recognized with the George Cross, the highest civilian award for gallantry. Additionally, I am personally ensuring that there will be no disciplinary action taken against you for your deviation from standard protocols. The George Cross was an honor that few people ever received, reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism in circumstances of extreme danger." For Matthews, it represented not only recognition of his courage but also official vindication of his split-second decision to break protocol in order to save the Queen's life. News of the Queen's visit and the impending award spread rapidly through the media, generating an even more intense wave of public support for Matthews and his family. The story had captured the imagination of people around the world, representing as it did the timeless themes of duty, sacrifice, and the protection of cherished institutions. The announcement also had significant implications for royal security protocols going forward. The incident had exposed potential weaknesses in the system, while also demonstrating the vital importance of allowing protection officers to use their judgment and training when facing unprecedented threats. The balance between following orders and taking initiative would need to be recalibrated in light of what had occurred. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Matthew's actions, with more than 90% of respondents indicating that they believed he had done exactly the right thing under the circumstances. The story had become a source of national pride, demonstrating that the institutions and people responsible for protecting the monarchy were worthy of the trust placed in them. Letters and messages of support poured in from around the world, including communications from other royal families, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Matthew's example. The hospital staff reported that they had never seen anything like the outpouring of public affection and inspiration that had accompanied his recovery. As Matthews prepared for his eventual discharge from the hospital and his return to duty, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few seconds of action. He had acted on instinct and training, never imagining that his decision would make him a global symbol of courage and dedication to duty. 6 weeks after the assassination attempt, Buckingham Palace was preparing for one of the most emotionally charged award ceremonies in recent memory. The investiture ceremony for David Matthews' George Cross had attracted international media attention and would be attended by dignitaries from around the Commonwealth, all gathered to witness the recognition of extraordinary heroism and service to the crown. Matthews stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his dress uniform for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The physical wounds from his confrontation with the gunman had healed completely, but the psychological impact of the incident continued to affect him in ways he was still learning to understand. Sleep came less easily now. He found himself constantly scanning crowds and assessing potential threats even during his off-duty hours. Sarah helped him with his medals and insignia, her own emotions clearly visible as she prepared to witness. Her husband received the highest honor for civilian gallantry. Their children, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old James, were both excited and nervous about the ceremony. Having struggled to fully understand why their father had suddenly become famous throughout the country and beyond, the family had been assigned a liaison officer to help them navigate the complex protocols surrounding the ceremony and the media attention that continued to follow their every move. Mrs. Catherine Ellis, veteran of royal protocol management, had become an invaluable guide through the maze of requirements and expectations that came with Matthew's new status as a national hero. Remember, Mrs. Ellis coached them during their final preparation session. The ceremony will be formal, but Her Majesty will want to speak with you personally afterward. She's been following your recovery closely and has expressed particular interest in how you and the family are adapting to all the changes. The drive to Buckingham Palace took them through streets lined with well-wishers and supporters, many holding signs thanking Matthews for his service and sacrifice. The public response had been overwhelming in its positivity, but it had also created new pressures and responsibilities that the family had never anticipated. When David first joined the protection service, inside the palace, the ballroom had been arranged for the investiture ceremony, with rows of seats for family members, colleagues, and distinguished guests. The media gallery was packed with representatives from news organizations around the world, all eager to document this historic moment of recognition for heroism in service to the monarchy. Commander Richardson, who had completed his investigation and strongly recommended Matthews for the award, sat with other senior officials from the Royal Protection Service. His final report had concluded that Matthews' actions were not only justified, but represented exactly the kind of initiative and courage that the service needed to protect the royal family in an increasingly complex security environment. Queen Elizabeth II entered the ballroom with her characteristic dignity, but those who knew her well could detect the personal satisfaction she felt in being able to personally recognize the man who had saved her life. At 96, she had presided over thousands of such ceremonies during her reign, but this one carried a special significance that was evident to everyone present. The citation for Matthew's George Cross was read aloud, detailing his exceptional courage and complete disregard for his own safety when confronted with mortal danger to Her Majesty the Queen. The formal language could hardly capture the split-second decision-making and physical bravery that had prevented what could have been a national tragedy, but it served to officially recognize his extraordinary service. As Matthews approached the Queen to receive his award, she spoke to him in a voice loud enough for the assembled guests to hear. "Sergeant Matthews, your actions that day embodied the very highest traditions of service to the Crown and to the nation. You risked everything to protect, not just my personal safety, but the institution that I represent, and the values that bind our Commonwealth together." The medal itself was surprisingly heavy as it was pinned to his uniform, but the weight seemed appropriate for an honor that represented such a significant moment in his life and career. The George Cross bore the inscription for gallantry, simple words that carried the full authority and gratitude of the monarchy and the nation. After the formal ceremony, the Queen requested a private audience with Matthews and his family, an unprecedented honor that reflected the personal nature of their connection following the assassination attempt. In her private study, away from the cameras and formal protocols, she spoke more intimately about the impact of his actions. "I've been thinking about what you did," she told him, "and I realized that your decision to act represented something that goes beyond training or duty. You made a choice that most people never have to make, and you made it without hesitation or regard for the consequences to yourself." Matthews listened respectfully, still somewhat overwhelmed by the personal attention from the monarch he had served for so many years. "Your Majesty, I hope that any of my colleagues would have done the same thing under similar circumstances. We all understand the importance of what we're protecting." And the Queen smiled at his modesty. "Perhaps, but we'll never know, will we? What matters is that when the moment came, you were ready and you acted. That speaks to your character and to the quality of the people who have chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting this institution." Their conversation touched on the changes that the incident had brought to royal security protocols, with new emphasis being placed on individual initiative and split-second decision-making in threat situations. Matthews' actions had essentially rewritten the training manual for royal protection officers. establishing new precedents for when breaking from standard procedures might be not only acceptable, but necessary. The media coverage of the ceremony was extensive and overwhelmingly positive, with commentators noting that the story had provided a rare and distinctive glimpse into the human side of royal protection and the extraordinary dedication of the people who serve in these roles. The footage of Matthews receiving his award was broadcast around the world, cementing his status as an international symbol of heroism and duty. However, with the recognition came new challenges and responsibilities that Matthews had not anticipated. He was now regularly invited to speak at security conferences and military events, sharing his experience and insights with other protection professionals. The attention was flattering, but also somewhat overwhelming for someone who had always preferred to serve quietly in the background. The incident had also changed his relationship with his work, where he had once been simply one member of a large protection team. He now found himself something of a celebrity within the service, with younger officers looking up to him as an example of courage under pressure. The responsibility of being a role model was something he took seriously, but found challenging to navigate. As the ceremony concluded and the family prepared to return home, Matthews reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few minutes of action on that autumn morning. The recognition was gratifying, but the knowledge that he had saved the Queen's life and protected the institution he served remained the most meaningful aspect of the entire experience. 2 years after the assassination attempt, the impact of David Matthews' heroic actions continued to resonate throughout British society and the international community in ways that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a split-second decision to protect the Queen had evolved into a symbol of courage, duty, and the enduring strength of the institutions that bind democratic societies together. Matthews had returned to active duty 6 months after receiving the George Cross, but his role within the Royal Protection Service had fundamentally changed. He was now Senior Training Instructor for Threat Assessment and Emergency Response, a position created specifically to incorporate the lessons learned from his experience into the preparation of future protection officers. By security services around the world, as his successful intervention had become a case study in effective, close protection techniques, the training facility at Hendon had been expanded to include a new wing dedicated to scenario-based exercises that replicated the kind of split-second decision-making that Matthews had faced during the assassination attempt. Young officers now practice breaking from standard protocols when circumstances demanded immediate action, but they were also taught to carefully evaluate threats and make decisions based on clear assessment rather than impulse. Sarah had adapted to their new circumstances with remarkable grace, though the family's privacy had been permanently altered by David's fame. Their children were now old enough to understand the significance of their father's actions, and both Emma and James had expressed interest in following careers in public service themselves. The family had received thousands of letters from around the world, many from young people inspired by David's example to consider careers protecting others. The Queen, now 98 years old, had made several public references to the incident. In her speeches and official communications, always emphasizing the dedication and sacrifice of those who serve to protect democratic institutions, her personal relationship with Matthews had continued to develop, with her making several informal inquiries about his family's well-being and career progression through her private secretary. Marcus Thompson, the would-be assassin, had been sentenced to life imprisonment after being found guilty of attempted murder and terrorism charges. The trial had revealed the extent of his planning and his deteriorating mental state in the months leading up to the attack. His case had led to improved screening procedures for public events and better coordination between mental health services and law enforcement agencies. The incident had also sparked a broader conversation about the security of public figures in an increasingly polarized political environment. Other countries had adopted training protocols based on Matthews' experience, and the Matthews Doctrine had become an accepted principle in close protection circles, emphasizing the importance of individual initiative when facing imminent threats. 2 protected persons, Dr. Helena Morrison, who had led the investigation into the incident, had been promoted to Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. partly based on her handling of the high-profile case. Her comprehensive report had become required reading for security professionals throughout the Commonwealth, providing detailed analysis of the threat assessment process and the factors that had enabled Matthews to successfully neutralize the danger. The public's fascination with Matthews' story had never fully subsided. Though the family had learned to manage the attention with help from the palace's media relations team, documentary filmmakers, authors, and journalists continued to request interviews. But Matthews had become increasingly selective about his public appearances, preferring to focus on his training responsibilities and his family's privacy. The annual Commonwealth Day celebration had been permanently altered by the events of that morning 2 years earlier. Security protocols were now more stringent, but the Queen had insisted that public access remain as open as possible, arguing that the monarchy's strength came from its connection to ordinary people. Matthews was always assigned to her protection detail during this event, tradition that had developed naturally and was now considered essential by all involved. On the second anniversary of the incident, the Queen made an unscheduled stop at the exact location where the attack had occurred. She placed a simple wreath at the base of the tree where the stray bullet had lodged, and spent several minutes in quiet reflection about the day that could have changed history. Matthew stood nearby in his familiar protective position, both of them acutely aware of how different their lives might have been if events had unfolded differently. The emotional impact of that moment was captured by photographers and became one of the most powerful images of the Queen's later reign. The photograph showed an elderly monarch paying tribute to the courage of those who protected her, while in the background stood the man whose split-second decision had saved her life and preserved the tenuity of an institution that had endured. For over 1,000 years, Matthew's children had grown up understanding that their father was considered a hero by millions of people. But they also knew him simply as the man who helped with their homework, attended their school events, and taught them the importance of serving others. Emma, now 12, had written a school essay about courage that focused not on her father's famous moment of heroism, but on his daily commitment to his family and his work. The George Cross that Matthews had received remained in a place of honor in their family home, but it was the handwritten thank you note from the Queen that he treasured most. Her words, written in her distinctive handwriting, expressed not only gratitude for his actions, but admiration for his character and dedication to duty. The broader implications of the incident continued to influence policy at the highest levels of government. The Home Secretary had commissioned a comprehensive review of protection services for all senior government officials and members of the royal family, incorporating lessons learned from Matthew's experience. The resulting changes had made Britain's protective services among the most respected and effective in the world. International recognition of Matthew's actions had led to speaking invitations from security conferences on every continent. He remained selective about accepting these opportunities. When he did speak publicly, his message was always the same: that courage was not about the absence of fear, but about acting correctly despite that fear, when duty and circumstances demanded action. The story had become part of British folklore, taught in schools as an example of public service and personal courage. Children across the country could recite the basic facts of what had happened that autumn morning, and many had chosen to pursue careers in law enforcement or military service after learning about Matthew's dedication to protecting others. As Matthews approached his 50th birthday, he reflected often on how a few seconds of action had defined not only his own life, but had touched the lives of countless others around the world. He had never sought fame or recognition, but he had come to understand that his experience carried responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal circumstances. The Queen, whose life he had saved, had lived to see her Platinum Jubilee celebrations and continued to carry out her duties with the same dedication that had characterized her entire reign. The knowledge that his actions had preserved this continuity gave Matthews a sense of satisfaction that no medal or public recognition could match. The legacy of that autumn morning lived on in the improved training of protection officers, enhanced security protocols that kept public figures safe, and the inspiration that his example provided to young people considering careers in public service. What had begun as one man's instinctive response to immediate danger had become a lasting testament to the power of courage, duty, and the willingness to risk everything for the protection of others. Matthews knew that history would remember him as the guard who saved the Queen, but he preferred to think of himself simply as someone who had done his job when it mattered most. In a world that often seemed to lack clear examples of heroism and selflessness, his story provided proof that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary moments and make decisions that changed the course of history. Through simple adherence to duty and courage in the face of mortal danger,